Okay, everybody. Here we are on our next series of webinars. Excuse me a second. On webinars on how to be more eco-friendly with your landscaping. Tonight we have Tim Waller. He's a nursery agent for Rutgers Co-op Extension in Southern New Jersey. Is somebody talking? Can you mute yourself? So Tim has a PhD in plant pathology, and he focuses on fungal plant pathology and has been a licensed applicator for a decade. His research focuses on around pest management and how to navigate multiple issues via single expenditures. He's keen to develop contemporary knowledge-based interfaces that will allow landscapers how to quickly and accurately diagnose whether that be an insect, a disease, or an animal by using a system and treat and prevent an ongoing program. So I've attended several of his lectures in person, and he does a great job. And so, Tim, it's really good to have you. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me. All right, everyone. So you might have heard in that introduction, I have been a pesticide applicator for quite some time. But what we're going to talk about today are all the other things that are so much more important than just chemistries or conventional chemistries. We're going to talk about everything that stresses a plant and how this really impacts diseases. So a little outline for today is I'm going to give you kind of a crash course in plant pathology and insect IPM, because it's really important and central to this concept of continual chronic stress on plants that ultimately leads to their demise. We're going to talk about types of plant stress, and we're going to break that down into a couple of categories. And then we're going to look at overall avoidance. If we can navigate plant stress as well as keeping diseases and insects, for that matter, out of our systems, that's a 1-2 punch, and we can have a lot of control. So I apologize in advance, but a little bit of a spoiler alert here is that if plants have less stress, you have less disease. If they have less stress, you have less insects. So it's just something to keep in your head and thinking about. So just so you know, if you do have a question, feel free to type it into the chat box. And there's a couple natural breaks in this, and we'll address them at that time. All right, so that's the overview for today. But before we really dive into that stuff, I am a plant pathologist, and I want to give you a background on plant pathology. I'm hoping you can take this beyond just the talk here today. And we're also going to talk a little bit about entomology or insect IPM. So kind of anthropomorphizing this, we all just lived through COVID. It was a really intense time, and something that I think we all learned is that a healthy person and a sick person are just as likely to get sick. However, looking at the vaccinations and the timing and the scales of all that stuff, the group that was most likely to get really ill were the group that were already predisposed to deal with something. Plants are very much that same way. Healthy plants handle stressors better. It's almost like this balancing act between plant stress and disease. So just keep in mind, healthy plants can avoid a lot of disease pressures. And the other thing too is plants can't get up. They can't get up from one location, go over here where there's a better environmental condition going on. So when we think about plant stress and when we think about plant diseases, we oftentimes blame just a fungal pathogen, a water mold, a bacteria, a canker. That's what we blame. However, there's a lot more going on. The best way to think about plant stress is this gradual decline. You're accumulating negative units or negative points where, we've got these this is the spiral of tree decline. The first time I saw it, so many things clicked in my head. And the whole point is that all of these factors, whether that's the age of the plant, the compaction level, whether there are defoliating insects, frost, salt damage, high traffic areas, all of these things negatively impact the plants that we care about, the ones that are horticulturally important to us, whether that's trees and shrubs, herbaceous perennials, or turf grass. The same principle is applying here. So again, we blame the pathogens, the nematodes, cankers, fungi, etc., when in reality, there's all these other things going on. Another way to look at this too is that a healthy plant, if we kind of bring these two slides together, is a healthy plant will naturally be stressed by something in the environment. Everything on the planet wants to eat plants, including us. And a healthy plant, it gets stressed and it bounces back. It gets stressed and it bounces back. However, if we kind of equate this to a human being, if something really intense comes in when they are already stressed, that can kind of push them over the edge. And ultimately, this is what leads to plant decline. This accumulation of stressors ultimately will lead to the decline and eventual death of these plants. So the take home from this slide is there's a lot more to it than just the disease when we're talking about plant decline. All right, so now we're going to get into plant pathology. Both of those last two slides are important to plant pathology and entomology. Just think about plant stress. All these different factors, they all add up. It's like you are getting negative points. All right, so plant pathology. If we were in person, we can still try to do it over the web. If everybody could make a triangle with their hands. The whole point of this is the disease triangle. This is the central dogma to plant disease. And in that disease triangle, we've got environmental factors that must be conducive to the pathogen being present, as well as the host plant that is able to be impacted by that pathogen, but still grow well within that environment. So, 15 years of education on this stuff and implementation, and it all comes back down to this geometric shape, which is good for us. We're not talking about fungicides. We're talking about the system at play. Because the whole idea when it comes to plant disease is you break one piece of that triangle. Whether we modify the environmental conditions or remove environmental stressors, we exclude the pathogen or make it so that they can't replicate and spread, or we modify what host plants we're growing, we're going to have the ability to knock out one piece of the triangle. And if we do that, we win. It's more easily said than done, but it all really does come back to this. And that's good for us because typically we can do something about it in this system. The other important thing to remember about plant disease is we've got the environment that all these plants are growing in. We've got host plants that can be attacked by a specific group of fungi per host plant. And the host plant and the fungi, or the pathogen in general, are coexisting. However, that disease triangle is happening at slightly different scales all over a landscape. So this is something you're going to hear me talk about a lot. It's very much a systems approach. We can look at very specific examples, but it's like learning the answer to one algebra problem. You need to know how the mathematics works, how that system works to be able to have some form of actionable change against them. The other cool thing about this disease triangle idea is that it's the same game with different players. Whether you're in a turf system, you're in a tree arboriculture system, or you're in a woody perennial system. It's all the same game, it's just slightly different nuances. So this is pulled right out of the textbook that I learned plant pathology. This is out of Agrios. I think they're up to version 7, something like that. So these are the principles of plant disease management or plant pathology management. And what I want you to notice about this, so we're talking about disease management, and we have yet to talk about fungicides. And the reason for that is because a huge percentage of the tactics that we have available to us, and arguably the more effective tactics, or holistically effective tactics, do not have anything to do with fungicide usage, whether that's conventional or what have you. And the whole point here is that if we look at these principles, first we'll look at resistance. If we can grow plants that we know are resistant to common diseases in an area, that gets us out of the disease triangle. If we can avoid bringing them in, which is what we're going to talk about at the very end, or exclude plants when they do come in to prevent the introduction, think of this as kind of like a quarantine, and to eradicate plants that we know are harboring materials. So with these principles and the disease triangle, that's really how you deal with plant disease. All right, so that's an extreme overview, but now we're going to talk a little bit about entomology and insect IPM, because it is intimately related when it comes to dealing with diseases that you're going to run into in the landscapes, nursery world, you name it. If plants are involved, insects and diseases are both present. So we don't have the triangle this time, but we have this circle, this IPM circle. And the whole point here is that it's this repeating thing. It's constantly moving, and we come into it at different sections. So first we've got prevention. This is where cultural practices come into play. This is where we are looking at environmental factors such as heating units, precipitation, all these other factors, as well as understanding pest biology. And then we monitor for these pests. Then we monitor for them. That's where we get into using growing degree days. We have an idea and we use pocket guides, and we know what we are supposed to be dealing with. That gives us an idea of what we're up against. That's another reoccurring theme. You have to know what you're up against, so you can monitor for them and know what practices in the prevention side of things you should really be targeting. And then it comes to treatment or management. But again, proper identification is critical, because that tells us what we need to be monitoring for and when they may be coming. Treatment also gets into beneficials, using growing degree days to do it at just the right time. And even in a world that utilizes conventional sprays, it is absolutely the last thing, because all of this other stuff, if done correctly, can be really, really beneficial to the whole concept of navigating insect pests. So real quickly, and I'm really just plugging this because I just put up a resource guide. I believe that may have been shared with you, but it's a really cool thing. Imagine knowing when a bug is coming. That's a really powerful tool. And the way we do that is through growing degree days. I'm going to answer the question that just popped up in comment here. So growing degree days, the best way to think of this is that humans, it doesn't matter if we are in Ecuador or Antarctica, we are still going to age at the same rate. However, if you take an insect and put them at those two locations, they will age completely differently. And it's because most insects need this heating element or these heating units to move through their life, just like the hands of the clock move us through the calendar. And we're accumulating these thermal units. And really all this does is, if we start counting the thermal units and we keep track of this stuff, we have a really good indicator of when a particular pest is going to come on. This is where we get into degree days and growing degree days. That GDD 50, so what that number means is that at 50 degrees Fahrenheit, above 50 degrees Fahrenheit, for a lot of pests, you start to have development. And as you go every 24-hour period, you accumulate these heating units. And basically what that'll tell you over time, say you were interested in when the caterpillar came out, or when they went into pupation, or when the adult came out or went into flight, these growing degree days in a lot of cases can get you really close. And for those of you that are not subscribed, this is not a New Jersey specific thing. It's geared towards people in New Jersey, but it's definitely a great resource. We've got the Plant and Pest Advisory. You know, that quick Google search will get you to it. And I recently just put up some new pest scouting guides, and there's all kinds of background information on how to utilize this information to navigate insect pests. Bear with me. You're going to see where these points come together here in just a second. And the whole concept here is, you know, we went through the disease triangle and I guess the IPM donut, if you will. The whole point of all of this is that it is a systems approach. There is no silver bullet. There's no one thing that you can do that will negate everything else. You have to be evaluating this at very much a systems level. And really what it comes down to is looking at the specific environment that plant is growing in. That could be the weather patterns all the way to the humidity trapped inside of a bush or a larger tree. And you have to understand what host plants are susceptible to what diseases and what insects. And just, you know, this concept of proper identification gets you closer to being able to really manage something. And in all of these cases, whether it's, you know, a weaker pathogen or something like a scale infestation, they dramatically stress plants. And how that works all together is what we're going to be talking about throughout most of this conversation today. But just remember, though, that there's all these different stressors that impact plants. And there's all these different pieces moving in plant disease as well as insect IPM. So the whole point is, you know, you have to be, it's a good and bad thing. It seems overly confusing, but it means there's a lot of targets that we can really hone in on that reduce the overall level of any given one stressor. So if we think about plant stress as a point, if every type of plant stress you accumulate a point, at some point in time, you'll have enough points where the most points loses. If we can reduce the number of points that are being accumulated against, you know, any particular plant, that's going to give us that plant the greatest probability of success. So just remember that there's a lot of stressors we can hone in on and how they kind of interact with all of them. So what I'm hoping you're asking yourself at this point, though, is why then do we have one plant that dies right next to another? And this is something that I saw all summer last year. We have a really high density of really, really big arborvitaes that are grown as far as, you know, their windbreaks, their you know, deterrents from people seeing into people's homes. But I saw a lot of really spotty death of these arborvitaes. I went out and I sampled some. I'm also interested in Phytophthora and root diseases. We went out and sampled some, and we didn't find a whole lot of disease right there. We didn't find disease that would kill them outright, like something like Phytophthora. But what we did find was that the ones that died maybe had a borer infestation, or their roots were all mangled, or their roots were in an area where the soil was more compacted or was more flood prone. Remember, all of these stressors are adding up points. So what likely happens when you've got one dead plant right next to a live plant is that the plant that has died or is in severe decline has something else or multiple other things going on with it than purely just a disease on it. You know, planting depth is a huge one. How you treat roots when you put them in the ground. I worked in landscape and arboriculture to pay for college, so I'm very familiar what the middle of summer is like, or early spring, and you got to get a ton of material in the ground. But But what likely happens in these cases is that there were more stress points on the plants that died than those that lived. That does not mean that the plants that lived in that scenario have 0 stress points. It means that you really should take a closer look at whatever cultural practices and do whatever you can to make those plants healthier. Because remember, it all adds up. All those points, they add up, they add up, they add up. If you send any plant material off to a diagnostic lab, wherever you're watching this video from, you have a land-grant university that most likely has a plant diagnostic lab. I'm with Rutgers, and we send our samples to the Rutgers Plant Diagnostic Lab. And what you will get back from just about every university system in the country is this line here: maintain plant vigor. And that's not a cop-out. That's very much a key and central point to all of this. Because what this means, though, is if we kind of read into this, it means remove plant stress the best we can. And what we're trying to do there is systematically target the plant stressors, remove those that we can from the system, because if we do that, any particular stress is going to be less impactful. They're kind of like a multiplier effect on each other. So if we can do something about the fertility in that system, that removes a plant stress. And it makes it so when they get a different type of damage to them, the plant is able to rebound quicker. And just like humans, healthy plants can fight off diseases better. All right, so we talked about plant pathology. Okay, I'm just looking at the questions. I agree. Less stress does work for humans as well. That's something that I try to be acutely aware of in my pre-tenure run. I'm just checking through. All right. And feel free to add more questions to the chat, everyone. So we talked about plant pathology, disease triangle, IPM. And the reason I brought that up is because one of the big stressors on plants that get diseases is insects. That's second in the topic we're going to talk about, but you'll see how all that stuff kind of comes together. All right, so plant stress. We know it exists. We know that the more stress we get, the worse off our plants are. So I'm going to break it down into 3 rough categories. The first one seems kind of short, but it's very similar to the second one here. So first off, we're going to start with mechanical damages. Pretty much all mechanical damage means is that somehow you or an environmental condition physically, mechanically hurt the plants that we care about. And that typically gets broken down into these groups short of something like hail damage. A big one is improper pruning. It happens all the time. Like I said, I used to work for a tree outfit. I've seen plenty of improper pruning. I've gone back and taken out a lot of trees that were improperly pruned some point, in the recent history. Girdling. In this image here, this is a human-led girdling event. However, if you plant plants incorrectly or let them get too pot-bound, they can girdle themselves. Some diseases will also girdle them. And then tools. So I have a project looking at Phytophthora in conifers right now, and what I've come to learn is that string trimmers are the most dangerous object when it comes to trees. And the reason for it is, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but the reason for it is very common to all of these different issues. Oh, that was just a slide there to indicate how you want to cut a tree branch. The whole point here is that, yeah, you have a piece of material you want to get out of the way. However, you want to do it in such a way that the plant is able to naturally close up and seal that location. So what happens with these different types of mechanical damages? So when it comes to something like improper pruning, whether that's with a pair of Felcos or that's with a chainsaw, basically, if the pruning cut is at the wrong location and the plant hasn't been able to close up, basically it just opens the door for pathogens to get in. This is something that I've seen a lot in nursery production as well as in landscape production. And the whole idea here is that we have made it so much easier for any type of pathogen to get into that plant tissue. Granted, if it's improperly done. Then girdling. Basically what girdling does, whether it's caused by the root system from planting, or it's caused by a trellis line, or it's caused by some type of stabilizer, basically what we have done is constricted the plant's ability to move water and sugars around within that plant tissue. So this girdling event will harm the vasculature. And if we think about plant stress, I kind of think of this girdling kind of like an asthma, where the plant can persist for quite some time, but its ability to grow, to run like a human would, its ability to perform at its peak ability is dramatically reduced because the resources it needs have been cut off. And then with tools, whether this is a lawnmower blade, a string trimmer, what can happen here is both of these effects combined. You can have, you can open the door for a lot of pathogens, and you can dramatically impact the girdling effect, or you can dramatically decrease the vascular movement of water and resources through using something like tools, damages caused by tools. So these are the human versions of this. I really like this slide too. I put it up here because, you can read it and look at it, but basically there's a ton of ways to kill a tree. And I think this is a really good way to think about this kind of stuff. There's a ton of ways to cause diseases. I'm exceptionally good at causing diseases. So if you think backwards from that, that's how you deal with this kind of stuff. One thing that comes up a lot is how we prune. I'm not a pruning expert by any means, but I do know that you need to respect the plant and where the plant is able to seal up quickly. Looking at branch collars, root collars, looking for a specific location where that plant can seal up. And then just leaving stuff that breaks. So say you have something like a freeze event, and it fractures down the plant. Well, that's a huge open door. That's a welcoming of insects and diseases into that system. We can go through all of these, but just kind of looking at this image here, as it should be, half of this image is based around that root system. We've got compaction, we've got part of the burlap, too much of the burlap left on, we've got the cage left on, spiking, girdling, all that kind of stuff. So just thinking about how to kill a plant, what you are thinking about in your head are plant stressors. And the more of those that you can remove from the system, it's like you get those points back, which, is important to this, overall idea of keeping plants alive. And that's just what I was getting at with that. All of those different factors, they all add up to a point that the plant can no longer function. It no longer has enough resources, and it will begin to decline. And this is everything we've talked about so far, has not included, conventional chemistries. If we can remove these stressors, the better off we're going to be across the board. All right, so looking at plant stress, we've been looking at plant stress, looking at biotic stressors. So real quick, I'm going to bounce back. So these types of damages here, this is caused by a human being, which is a macro vertebrate pest, if you want to think of it that way. We are the best organisms on the planet at killing plants. And then I'm going to jump back to this. And then we look at this slide here. What we're going to talk about in the next couple slides are organisms that attack plants. We've gotten a little bit smaller, and ultimately we're going to end up with insects and kind of nuisance diseases, if you will. But before we get into that, I'm sorry, I got a little ahead of myself. When we think about what a plant is growing in, they are in constant competition with other plants around them. The only examples of this are highly manicured gardens, with a very functional and appropriate mulch layer. Even if you've got a great shrub that's grown and it's got a very small turf all around it, it's still competing with plants. Some competition's okay, some is not. One of the other problems with weeds is they are stealing resources. That's a plant stressor. They can restrict the airflow around the base of the plants. That can be a plant stressor, and it can also incite disease. But a lot of weeds can function as a secondary host for some of the diseases that we deal with, meaning that we may not see it killing the weeds so much, but at some point it could be present and it could jump over into the plants we care about, that we don't consider weeds. And it's also a great structure for a lot of pests to hide. So going back to the pruning damage, all that kind of stuff, think about that same mentality, but now we're just scaling down in the organisms. All from the chainsaw all the way down to the tiny little borer insects, they all weaken plant defenses. And the reason for this is that they are limiting the plant's ability to gather resources, to grow, to build structures to close things out, or they have to expend nutrients. And, you know, all of those different sizes, they all create wounds. A lot of plant pathogens have very specialized structures that help them break into plant material. If we just open the door for them, they can get right in. And a lot of other things that they can't normally get in could get into the system. And, you know, we're thinking about this herbivory and foliar leaf spots, things that take away the photosynthetic engines of a plant. The more and more of those that we lose, not only does the plant have to put resources into remaking them, but it's not getting any resources back when they're lost. And all of this adds up. All of these different stressors add up, add up, add up. So some of the larger wildlife damages that we deal with, we've got groundhogs, we've got deer, which we know are excellent at removing photosynthetic material. And even some birds. Here we've got this sapsucker. And what I want to draw your attention to, you know, with these couple images here, is that every time that deer eats a leaf, that leaf has to regrow. That plant utilized resources to make a new leaf. Here we've got this sapsucker damage, and you can tell that this one's been hit numerous times, so it may not have a lot of other stresses, but they're not open wounds. So what happened here is that the bird came in, it fed, and that plant used energy to close it up, used energy to close it up. In all these scenarios, the plants are constantly putting resources into fixing things instead of growing and being as healthy as they could be. So a lot of large wildlife damage can damage vasculature. Something that groundhogs do at a lot of commercial nurseries is they sharpen their teeth on very expensive trees and shrubs. And I've seen it get so bad that people are losing, you know, tens of thousands of dollars due to one family of groundhogs. They create wounds, stuff can get in, and they overall can reduce the ability to photosynthesize. These same points are going to come up over and over again. So I was talking about insect ID and, you know, or problem ID, interacting with your local diagnostic lab, how important that is. So if we go out into a system and here's a problem, what do we do about it? Do we start looking for insects? Do we start pruning to increase airflow? What we do is highly dependent on what something is. So here we've got one caused by an insect, this budworm, and one caused by a fungal pathogen with this needle cast. So ID is critical, regardless of how you are going to go about managing this. So ID, absolutely important. So we aren't going to talk about all the insects and all the diseases, but I want to drive home a couple of key points that I think are important for understanding this concept of plant stress. So in this group here, we've got the insects that burrow or bore their way into the actual plant material itself. We've got our pine bark beetles, our Ips bark beetles, our ambrosia beetles. We've got clearwing borers. We've got the flathead borers, something like this bronze birch borer or emerald ash borer. And then we've got our leaf miners. What these types of insects do is they get into the system and they can disrupt the vasculature. They can chew parts of the plant away so they no longer function like they're supposed to. And in a very insidious kind of way, a lot of these insects have developed the ability to sense when plants are stressed. A lot of plants give off alcohols when they're stressed, and this basically calls the insects in. I'm sure the plants didn't mean to do it that way, but that's kind of how it has evolved. Not only that, a lot of these insects, when they burrow in, they bring fungi with them. They'll bring it in, that fungi can then colonize, while the insect is in there destroying the cambial layer or disruption of movement of water or nutrients. Overall, these types of insects, they can dramatically weaken a plant, and they bring in all kinds of stress. So it's not just one point for a damaging insect, it's multiple points of stress that are impacting the overall survivability of this hypothetical horticultural plant. So we've got our borers, and the next big group that I think is really important to our understanding of how stress impacts disease are the scale insects. And to a larger context, piercing and sucking insects. In the example of the scale insects, they basically represent this chronic stress. The plant is constantly losing resources to these insects, and it is constantly trying to grow new plant material to be able to compensate for this constant dramatic feeding by these little insects. So that's a stress point, but that's a stress point that comes up every day. It's constantly, chronically stressing these plants. I've seen a huge correlation between the presence of scale insects and full-blown Phytophthora outbreaks. And the reason for it is that the plants were so stressed that this pathogen was able to win and fully colonize the trees. Something also important to note, a lot of the diseases that get vectored by insects are done so by these piercing and sucking insects. Leaf hoppers, mealybugs, aphids, they all kind of fall into that category. But what I want to drive home here is that insect pressure is this chronic, regular, repeating stress on a plant that can really have a profound impact on whether or not that plant succumbs to disease. Another one here that can mimic the visual of plant disease is grub damage. If you're dealing with turf landscapes, grubs can be a really big deal. If you've got a lot of woody materials, weevils can be a really big deal. And basically, both of these get into the system. They start chewing on roots. It's basically, go back to that asthma example, the organism can't bring enough resources in. It's constantly being attacked and losing its ability to pull up resources. Yeah, so they can look very much similar to a disease. Well, something I've also noticed here, at least anecdotally, is that where I see this high level of soil-borne organisms, there's also a higher disease pressure in those areas, or apparent disease pressure in those areas. And it's because they're constantly being stressed. And the whole point, looking at these insect pressures is that, you can see it here, this one here, that's defoliating insects. There's a bunch of other stressors like this, but they all add up. They kind of push this wheel forward of plant decline. All right, so I'm going to jump into another section. So I'm going to talk about diseases that make diseases worse, which is kind of abstract, but hear me out on it. So again, we need to know what we're dealing with. Are we dealing with an insect or are we dealing with a disease? Both of these are, really important things to understand. So there are a couple example pathogens that I'm going to bring up here. So here we've got something like Rhizosphere. If you've got a spruce tree, or you grow spruce trees, or you manage spruce trees, there's almost certainly you have seen this in your life before. But here's the kicker with a disease like this. When you start seeing symptoms, that means the infection started a year, 2 years, 3 years ago. And what's been happening in that whole process of time is that the tree has been stressed. It's this chronic, regular stress. It's when the pathogen gets in, we're starting to get this brown visual, but it's degrading the plant's ability to collect resources from the sun, and it's being siphoned out by the pathogen. Something a little bit similar to that are the tip lights. Here, Phomopsis is used as an example. The spring or the tip lights group, what they do is they go after the succulent new growth that the plant just put on. The plant just paid for this metabolically, and these pathogens will come in and they'll remove that from the system. So not only is the plant not getting the benefit of this new growth, it is also immediately losing the resources that it put into this new growth. So something like this is a chronic condition where it's constantly siphoning a little bit of materials out, where something like a tip light is attacking, where they just put all the resources of that plant, the pathogen comes in, goes after it, takes it out of the system. Another example here is I put up dogwood anthracnose because this is an important disease, and dogwood anthracnose, if left to its own devices long enough, can kill dogwood trees. And the reason for that is you have this amount of plant stress year 1, this amount year 2, this amount year 3, and ultimately the plant will succumb. But there are a lot of other diseases, that are superficial in nature, that create leaf spots, lead to defoliation events. And what I wanted to just kind of bring home the example here is that if the leaves are the photosynthetic engine, this is where the plant makes all of its resources, and they are being attacked by a pathogen over and over and over and over, the plant is losing resources, making new leaves. It has diminished returns on the leaves with these leaf spots on them. And over time, there's a net reduction in that plant's ability to grow and to prosper. So this is adding points to that spiral of tree decline. And generally speaking, when the pathogen examples that I just put up there, I would not consider them the heavy hitters. I would put Phytophthora, Pythiums, Flaviopsis. There's a number of other pathogens that I would consider the heavy hitters. They've got, damage multipliers to them. They bring a lot of points to the table. But these superficial or foliar exclusive or overall considered weak diseases, their biggest impact is this repeated plant stress and this reduction of photosynthetic products. The other thing that's important to note here too is that if you have a plant disease like this, you may want to really consider the cultural practices that you've been implementing in that area. Go back to the disease triangle. Can you do something about it to be able to manage it a little bit better? All right, and then so the last plant stress we're going to talk about is abiotic stress. So I can't say this enough. Proper site selection and putting the right plant in the right site is critically important. That's kind of like a golf handicap. It gives you an indication of what that plant is able to withstand. If you put a plant that doesn't want to grow there, that's a lot of stress. That's a lot of inherent stress on that plant. You put the right plant in the right location, it can handle more stressors. And this kind of gets into herbivory as well. I'm hesitant to say deer-resistant plants, but proper selection of your plants in the right locations can really help keep leaves on the plant tissue, keep the photosynthetic engines there. You want to avoid waterlogged conditions pretty much across the board and poorly drained soils. Something that I would like everyone to do is, depending on what you do, if you manage a landscape, ground maintenance, production facility, whatever it is, go out after the next big rain event or towards the end of the rain event and see how water moves. That gives you an indicator of plants that, or locations you should probably avoid with plants that don't like wet feet. Fertility is critically important. That's the same kind of thing. Fertility is critically important. You want to set your plants up to be able to handle the most stress in a given location. And fertility and pH are big components of that. So just remember, less plant stress equals less disease. And talking a little bit about site management, I would be remiss if we're talking about plant stress to not put a couple telephone poles into the presentation. So when it comes to planting trees, plants or trees and shrubs for that matter, they have a root flare for a reason. That gives them structural, it's a structural function as well as a very biological function. When trees are planted up and they look like they're a telephone pole coming up out of the ground, they've lost their ability for gas exchange. They're very much kind of the nose and mouth of the tree that allows them to exchange a great amount of gases. If you cover that up, they can't do it. And the tissues in the root flare are not the same types of tissues as root systems. They are not meant to be constantly submerged under soil. So that can lead to decay, which can lead to wounds, which can lead to rots, which can lead to full decline of that plant. Oh, I forgot that text was there. And just say no to mulch volcanoes. You can plant a tree perfectly, but then if you mound a giant amount of mulch all the way around it, it's like you planted that tree too deep in the first place. Again, these tissues do not want to be in contact with soils and mulches. The tissues are just not designed to be able to handle that. Unless you fully plan on replanting all these trees, you really want to avoid this type of situation in general. And that, this is what trees are supposed to look like. Trees have root flares. Maybe this gets into conversations with clientele, but this is what trees are supposed to look like. This is how they get to be big and beautiful and healthy. We make sure that they have their gas exchange capability. If we can take that stress out of the equation, that means, they're able to withstand some other factors. So irrigation, we could spend multiple lectures talking about this, but I do want to get through a couple more things here. So like I said, go out, look for water movement in your systems. Understanding the water dynamics of whatever plant you're dealing with is really important. If you water them too much, that's bad. If not enough, that's bad. So treating plants on a one-by-one basis is a really good approach. However, I am a realistic person. I understand that's not always the case, but I would implore you, if you can reduce overhead irrigation, you will have less disease across the board. If you can just water the root systems of the plants you want to grow, better off you're going to be. And this is kind of what I was getting at with watching for water movement. A lot of pathogens, a lot of the heavy hitters, particularly Phytophthora and Pythium, they get moved around in water currents. They can swim in water currents. I had a video, but it's a little bit too long for this presentation. So all I'm asking you to do is to have an idea of whatever properties you're at, to notice how these water currents are moving. And then you can avoid plants and avoid problems in those locations that are prone to something like Phytophthora. And again, ID is absolutely critical. If you have a plant that you suspect is a root rot, you need to know if it's Phytophthora or a fungus, because Phytophthora is an oomycete, totally different animal or organism for that matter. So the whole point is all of these stress factors, they all add up. It could be insects that are opening the door for diseases. It could be, a lawnmower blade. They all add up to these factors. And it's really important to address this at a holistic level, because if we look at it at a holistic level, there are things we can do. It's no longer insurmountable. So if we can do just this without talking about chemicals, conventional materials, if we can do just this, we're going to win most of the time when it comes to battling plant diseases. So I have one more section here, and I'm gonna cherry pick it just for seminar sake. All right, so avoidance and sanitation. Sanitation is key. If we can keep all the plant stressors, if we can grow a perfectly healthy plant, but we can avoid bringing diseases in, we're going to be so much better off. We can get away with, less impactful, ecologically impactful treatment mechanisms. So I like this slide here. So for those of you that are in the landscape side of things, it's just grass clippings, right? Well, depending on where you just drove that material through, it could have fungal hyphae in it, pathogenic hyphae. It could have something like a water mold spores in it or sporangia. It could have rust spores that can go from turf to broadleaf, woody plants. And you could also have insects as well as insects' eggs simply in this little packet here. So you always want to sanitize your materials, clean and sanitize your materials if you think you've been in a diseased area. You want to stop the spread of this stuff. Pathogens come in all kinds of ways. They can be blown in, moved by water, moved by transplants, by animals on our boots, and all kinds of equipment as well. So just being cognizant of how they're moving. And they're really good at hanging out. So think about in your system where these different pathogens are persistent. Where is it dirty with organic debris? That's a good place to start when it comes to dealing with pathogens. So I like this slide here. I'm not sure if all these numbers are exactly right on point, but if we just think about a gram of soil and it's got tons and tons of living organisms in it, if some of these are pathogenic, we think about something like a dirty boot, well, maybe we're moving around a lot of diseases. So kind of putting these concepts together here, if we think about where pathogens get into our system, where they persist in our system, and then the tools we use in our systems, well, there's a good chance that the practices that we are utilizing could be spreading diseases. Again, I am a realistic person. I know you can't put a Tyvek suit around an equipment. Here, this is a zero turn, but it could be a tractor as well. The whole point, though, is that if you think you're in, if you think you are in a system that there is an issue, try to avoid spreading diseases around as well. All right, so I'm gonna hop to kind of my summary slide, but just to address that question there, blowers, something that we don't have time to talk about today. I unfortunately work a lot with boxwood blight. One thing that I've really promoted, if we think about the biology of boxwood blight, so boxwood blight has sticky spores. Those sticky spores need to get moved around in water to be the most effective. If we go out, say we go out to a landscape planting, all the boxwood leaves have fallen off. Best way to remove leaves is with a leaf blower. And all we've really done now is, especially if it's damp or early in the morning, we've just spread those spores everywhere. And that applies to all these other different pathogens as well. But leaf blowers, when it's wet outside, are a very dangerous plant pathology object. All right, so I'm gonna hop. Basically, what I was getting at here is just look at your tools, make sure they're clean, make sure they're sanitized. If you're dealing with diseases, don't dig up a diseased tree and then plant a new tree with the same shovel without cleaning and sanitizing it. Boots are my pet peeve. I've been muddy plenty of times, but if we think about how many organisms are in a gram of soil, there could be a lot in here as well. So all I was really trying to drive home with this section is look at your system. It doesn't matter if landscape to nursery production, it doesn't matter. Just look at your system and try to think about where diseases come in, where you can stop them from moving around, and how you can clean and sanitize what you can clean and sanitize to avoid as many pathogens as possible. Because all we're really doing here is it's a giant balancing act. We're just balancing items between reality and practice. But if we can limit plant stress overall, the more of these factors we can remove, the better chances any of our plants have it growing. So with that, I think, hold on, go back to that in a second. So with that, my name's Tim Waller. I'm with Rutgers Cooperative Extension. Put a lot of time and energy into this plant and pest advisory. Do a Google search. I run the LONT, Landscape, Ornamental, Nursery, and Turf page, as well as the Christmas tree page as well, which is really, really practical too if you also have conifers. That's my contact, and thank you very much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Tim, you just did a fantastic job covering so much information concisely and clear. I'm very, very impressed. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Going through my years of doing plant health care and insecticide and pesticides and everything, one thing that I can't stress any more than you did, but the wrong plant in the wrong place is the biggest obstacle to overcome. So many landscape architects just put things in that they're cookie cutter approaches, and it just makes all kinds of problems down the line to manage that.
Right.
But no, just terrific, and we can take some questions now from the crowd.
Hey guys, I just wanted to thank Tim, because I've been in the field a long time, and I've been thinking about a lot of things that he's spoken about, but I just wanted to congratulate him on a really logical coalescence of the subject here.
Yeah,
it really put everything into perspective, and for me, even though I've been talking about it for years, I thoroughly enjoyed it, and thank you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that immensely.
So how bad are spotted lanternflies going to be this year?
I don't know. We don't know enough, at least to my understanding, to know how impactful a mild winter will be. When it first started, when we had our first really heavy winter, I think that was 3 years ago, there was an inclination that they would be reduced, and they seem to be reduced. However, I think it's more of a case of, as lanternfly moves into a new location, they rapidly expand, and either they exhaust resources or develop new predation. And it seems to be where you've got the highest outbreak or the newest locations in their spread.
I'm glad you brought up the weather. So with this very mild winter we have, what kind of problems can we expect?
Well, I wouldn't say I've got a PhD in entomology, but I would suspect a little bit earlier release of maybe some soil-borne insects. At least that's my feeling on that. It's really going to dictate what happens early season is really going to be dictated by the type of weather we're experiencing right now. Is really where I am in New Jersey. It's getting really warm, and then it's raining immediately after, and it's staying in this 60 to 70 degree realm. If that happens too many more times, we're going to have a lot of leaf spots. If we get that kind of weather later into May, we're going to have a lot of cankers. And I fear that we would have explosive scale populations if the conditions are really warm, and then it's protected from people being able to manage them. That's my read on it. I wouldn't put that in the Farmer's Almanac, but that's my read on the situation.
Well, they make mistakes too.
Right.
All right. Are there any more questions? No. So, okay, Tim, would you put up the last slide so we can show the coupon we're offering?
Sure.
So for everybody who attended, if you go to our website, terraenvironmental.com, and you know, take a look at our product lines. There's a lot there to look at. And then if you decide to order something, use this code TREE25 and you'll get $25 off your order. And this does expire on April 12th. So one more thing I just want to cover. Next week, we have some very special people doing a presentation. They're longtime friends of mine. He's taken on the moniker of the Tree Whisperer. And Jim and Basha, like I said, known for a long time. They have taken a very spiritual approach with working with trees. And if you haven't heard them before, I think it would be a very, very different approach, but a very fulfilling approach too, I think. So with that, if there aren't any more questions, we're going to shut this down for the night. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.